A few weeks ago, I made a video talking about the state of Siege, at least as I see it. Now, I don't really usually make discussion-based content like that, but this actually turned out to be one of my most well-received videos of the past year. Little did I know that the conversation surrounding some of what I commented on in this video would kind of heat up over the coming weeks. The sentiment in the community following the release of Crimson Heist and the announcement of North Star is, well, we need more. After breaking a concurrent player count record on Steam just a few short months ago, Siege's player base is back into steady decline, and it's hard to point the finger anywhere other than to the content that Ubisoft have elected to focus on for the year. This is Siege's content problem. What everyone seems to be talking about is maps. So when people talk about new content, maps are a big component. Because the dilemma with the maps is that there is so many of them and so few of them are good. I have all the maps here sorted by the competitive map pool. And now Villa is the newest one, coming out almost 3 years ago now. And that's just the newest map in the competitive pool. Then when you look at the ranked pool, yet again, the newest map that's still in the pool is Villa, which came out in mid 2018. Now you had Outback in there. It spent a little time in there, but eventually got removed as well. It was kind of a failed experiment. So this is what people are talking about when they talk about, like, you know, the lack of new content, is the fact that our newest map at this point is almost 3 years old, at least that most people are playing. Outback and Fortress are newer, but they've kind of been sort of ousted from the part of the game that most people play. And then there's the issue of like the casual map pool, and that the casual map pool is kind of the biggest part of the game. And it makes the game hard to learn because people are just playing everything, you know? You've got everything in there, from like competitive maps to the maps that are kind of just shit shows. And then of course you have Bartlett, which is just effectively removed from the game, but is still in the game's files for some reason. At least when we were still getting new maps, Outback was put into ranked and had an impact there. But it was kind of a failed experiment. It was never really seriously considered for competitive. And that was year 4, season 1. We're at year 6, season 1 now. So that's 2 years on, and then they're not planning any new maps for this year. And then they're going to rework Outback at the end of the year. So if the roadmap holds, Outback will have been released, reworked, all in the span of 3 years and before a new map even gets released. And then you've got, just before that, before Outback, was Fortress, which lasted even less time in ranked, and it was also not a competitive map. Again, you've got major issues with the most recent two, which brings us back all the way to Villa, which again, we're about a month out from it being 3 years old itself. So then what they've decided to do in the meantime is rework maps. Also, this is kind of a mixed bag. You've got like Chalet and Border, which are good for keeping okay maps fresh and bringing them back into the competitive fold, but they get figured out pretty quickly because they're similar to what was there before. And then you have like the larger scope reworks like Canal, Hereford, and to some extent Skyscraper, which are intended to make the less competitive maps, I guess, just more competitive. And these usually have a pretty mixed reception. Now, other than the Hereford rework, which I think is the worst thing they've ever done in terms of maps, usually these reworks are for the better, but sometimes you just have ones that are beyond saving. And then you have this whole concept of like casual reworks, which, while I really like what they did with the house rework, if they aren't even going to try to at least put it in unranked, or, you know, test the waters with it being a little bit more competitive of a map, it's basically just a complete waste of resources. It benefits nobody, and it's going to be the same when they do this Favela rework this year. Now, with this season, we got a rework of Border, which I like the map as it is right now, but it's way closer to what in the past they've called a map buff, which had more in common with Clubhouse map buff than it did with, like, for example, even the Cafe rework, which I would say in the grand scheme of things was pretty minor, even though it's well liked. The map really plays out the same as it did before, and as far as new content goes, it's really just extremely weak. Like, it took everyone about a week to kind of figure out what was different and how to play around it. It's just kind of boring, even if it's generally good and the changes are for the better. So what does that really leave in terms of new map content? Well, it's basically all locked to events right now. Now, not all events do new maps. I mean, you had Apocalypse, which was Outback, and Doctor's Curse, which was Theme Park, and they basically didn't change the layout of the map at all. They just made minor changes that were kind of focused on making the sites playable with the new mechanics. And then some of them you have that are kind of specific to one game mode. Like, you couldn't make the Streets map for Sugar Fright into a bomb map, or the same thing with Fort Truth from Showdown. But even still, you know, they put a lot of effort into these maps, which I can only assume is being diverted away from making new maps. And there's not anything inherently wrong with that. I just, you know, I want to see that temporary content somehow meaningfully added to the game rather than just disappear forever after 2 weeks. Like Fort Truth, for example, the Showdown map could have been a 1v1 map for customs. Like, you know, people 1v1 on House. I've never done it, but for someone that map could have been cool. Streets could have been reskinned, or whatever they called the Streets map. It could have been reskinned and remained as a deathmatch or warm-up map. And then you have the stadium maps, which are kind of the only new version of like a bomb map. And I understand the drive for the stadium maps to be a limited time and exclusive because they're tied to generating hype for the Invitational, which they're a really good tool for. But when they're the only new content for like a full year, it just would be nice if Ubisoft could find a way to keep them around in some meaningful way. Or, I hate to say it, but if they just poured some of that effort into making actual new maps rather than the, like, I guess, mashups that Stadium is. And again, I say this and I love Stadium. I just think it's a shame that some of the effort is being put into creating, honestly, great maps and having them essentially go to waste. So what I would do in terms of maps, if the issue really is like just the file size that they can put into the game, do spring cleaning. At this point, I don't care. Get rid of Bartlett. Honestly, probably get rid of Tower too. If they're removed from the active map pool, I think at least keep them available as an optional download for like custom games or something. Or bring them back as like small events, or both, preferably. And if the event maps themselves aren't going to stay around as a permanent part of the game in one way or another, I'd like to see those two just kept around as an optional download. And then bring us some new maps. I think even just like one a year would be great. In general, I kind of want to draw the comparison with like Halo 3 custom games, which I've already talked about how formative those were for me, in that the longevity of that game, for me at least, came from the freedom that was allowed by the user-generated content like Forge, and the ability to make your own maps and make your own experience out of it. Now, I'm not saying Siege needs a Forge mode or a map editor, but giving more freedom to players to choose how they want to play the game could go a long way to sustaining the game. You know, people have already figured out how to do things like Michael Myers. Yeah, it just doesn't feel like Ubisoft is giving the tools to people who want to do that stuff. So I think just allowing those maps to kind of be played around with would be a good idea. And then you have the operators, which have been a little bit of a point of contention, but not as much. Last year, they went down from 2 to 1 per season. And I actually think this is a good change. I think the recent operators have been better because of it, because the last season that we got 2 was Ace and Malusi. And then after that, we got Flores, Aruni, and Zero. And I think all 3 of those have been top notch in the design department, at least, even if they're a little bit underwhelming in their impact. I think this is okay, though. You know, I'd rather get 4 or even less operators that just add interesting mechanics to the game, but aren't like overpowered, than if we got 8 Aces or Malusis per year that are kind of overtuned derivatives of existing operators, I guess. Because Ace is just kind of a hard breacher, and Malusi was just kind of like another trap operator, essentially. And then what you have instead of more operators is just more reworks. In general, I think they might get into a habit of kind of forcing reworks on operators that don't really necessarily need them. It hasn't really happened yet, but I do think there are some operators still that should be on the docket for reworks, like Blackbeard, Finka, Doc, and really anyone with a shield, I think, could be looked at. And that's just beyond what's confirmed, because I know we've got Malusi and Goyo on the docket as well. But in my opinion, they should only be employing reworks where it's necessary, because I don't like when they take subtractive measures with the game, if I haven't already made that clear through this video and my previous one. And by that, I mean removing an entire mechanic, such as like Tachanka's turret, for example. Even though he's a better and more functional operator because of it, I don't really like that the original operator is removed from the game to make room for the reworked version, when the reworked version is essentially just a different operator entirely. And my preference is just not to rework unless it's necessary. But I do think that currently at least some should be on the table. And at the very least, I would say they're necessary for like Blackbeard, because the shield is just kind of a broken mechanic. Finka, who not only doesn't really succeed at her role, but she's honestly kind of a detriment to your team when you bring her. And Melusi, whose mechanic of just slowing you down when you enter her area of effect is just unfun to play against, and has just changed the game in a bad way. So I think in theory, if they stop doing new operators and maps tomorrow forever, then if the game was well balanced, it should be good forever. I don't play CSGO, but just look at CSGO, for example. It doesn't get that much new content, but people still play it just because they like the core game. I don't think Siege is there yet, at least not to the point where they could sustain interest in their game without a constant drip of new and meaningful content. And even though I played the game for 4 years, I think even I am included in that. I think with this season, with Crimson Heist, I've played less than I have in a long time, and I'm losing interest in the game pretty rapidly. But yeah, I don't have much more to say about the operators than that. I think the one per season is good. My biggest problem is just that the slack isn't really being picked up elsewhere, like with new maps or other things that I'll get to. I think then you have to consider the balancing and gameplay tweaks that they're making too. Stuff like the Gone 6, which is good, but it's not really enough on its own to really be too interesting. It's a welcome addition to the game, but it kind of had like a minimal impact on just the casual level of play, by which I just mean casual and ranked, essentially, just not competitive. And you could say the same thing about the Hard Breach charge too. It just was like, you kind of brought it once and were like, oh, that's cool. And then you moved on. You probably maybe equipped it on a couple operators and that's about it. And then there's bigger things that they're teasing too, like the attacking and droning changes, the repick and the drone after death, which my biggest question right now is when are we going to see it and what is it going to look like? Because that will definitely dictate how big of an impact I think this will have. It will be a massive change to the game. It's one of the biggest and most fundamental changes they've ever attempted. And yet I really don't think it's going to do all that much to sustain people's interest. People aren't really going to be able to make too much content around it or really experiment with it all that much. It'll just be one of those things where like, it'll be introduced to the game and then people will figure it out pretty quickly and then it will just be the new norm. Now it might improve the flow and feel of the game a bit, which is important that people just enjoy the game and the gameplay loop. But for me, it's not clear how big of an impact this will have in the long term. Yeah, I just don't know how much interest it will generate in the game, which I think is the concern that a lot of people talking about this issue have at the moment. And then beyond that, there's just general balancing changes like your mid-season patch and stuff like that. I think it's okay that it's slowed down a little bit because the balance of the game is pretty good right now. And it's kind of to be expected that after like 6 years, you would start to kind of equalize out a little bit and start to find like a balance that you're pretty happy with, at least as a developer, I assume. I would like to see a little bit more risk taking though, in terms of the tweaks that they employ. Like what they did on the test server with Nook seemed like a positive direction, even though I don't really have a strong opinion on the change itself and they haven't brought it into the main game yet. It was only on the test server, but I like the idea of what they were doing there. They wanted to kind of fundamentally change and shake up an operator that was a bit underwhelming, and I thought that was cool. I think they could do more of that. And then when it comes to content, I think Ubisoft is hoping that the events pull a lot of weight here. They want them to do a lot of legwork. Now, events, I've kind of already talked about it as it pertains to map content, but I want to talk about them in general too. Now, it's clear, obviously, that a lot of work is being put into the events, and that's a good thing. Like, they're cool and they feel fun and like unique experiences. So what is the problem with them? I mean, you blink and you miss them. They're around for 2 weeks, and then if you don't happen to be able to play them, you're just kind of shit out of luck. So in a sense, it's kind of wasted effort. Like I said, a lot of effort is going into them. They feel like high effort ordeals, and they're usually fun. But if the event flops, I don't want to say like Apocalypse, because I did enjoy Apocalypse, but it was clear that people weren't playing it in the way they intended it to be. In which case, I have to say that the development time spent on it was a bit of a waste. And they introduced these new like gameplay ideas and concepts that aren't really meaningfully being integrated into the game. I mean, Sugar Fright at this point was, I think, over 6 months ago. And a lot of people thought it was going to be like a segue into a team deathmatch mode that people could use for warm-up or, I don't know, just for fun. But nothing ever came of that, and they haven't even really talked about if they're going to put in any kind of like respawn mode into the game. And I can think of way more examples. I mean, even just like a small example is how from the Outbreak event, they had the big guys who like knocked you back. That kind of eventually became the mechanic for Nomad's air jabs. I just would like to see more stuff like that coming out of these events and less like just one-off, have fun for 2 weeks, and then this is going away forever. So I can't ignore the elephant in the room though, that these are probably massive money makers for them. When they release these skins with these events, you have to pay like $80 or whatever to get all of them. I don't think I've ever once paid for one of those skins, but there are certainly people out there buying that. My question is just, is that money going back into development, or is it just being pocketed? Because it doesn't seem like it's really making an impact on the quality of the content that comes out. So in terms of events, I've had kind of bad things to say about how the events are just limited time and then they're gone forever. But I think it's okay for the like premier events, like the big event for the season, to just be like a limited time. I just like to see the concepts that they're exploring in them have more of a meaningful impact down the road. Like if Sugar Fright turned into a real deathmatch mode. But what I will say is that the arcade events, which are the smaller events that they do throughout the seasons, are just a total waste right now. They've done Golden Gun 3 times, which Golden Gun is fun. Everyone loves Golden Gun. But it hasn't developed at all other than just the maps changing. If anything, I've heard a lot of people say they made it less fun. I don't actually know what they changed, but I think they removed some gadgets and stuff that people were just enjoying messing around with. But either way, I mean, Golden Gun just is what it is. It's not even really a unique concept. It's just something that Siege kind of stole and used for itself. And then there was Attrition, which most people probably don't even remember. I think it went for 1 weekend. I was out of town. I didn't even get a chance to play it, but I watched some videos and it seemed boring, I guess. It kind of just played out the same as your typical ranked and unranked game, but just with a tiny bit of shakeup. The mechanic itself could create some potentially interesting lineups, but it's not really something that you couldn't do just like with your friends in casual or whatever. So I don't really think that the mechanic being explored there was all that interesting. And then technically, I believe they qualified Legacy as a arcade game mode, which was where they just had a mode that was supposed to like roll the game back to year 1 or whatever. But they didn't even really execute it well because a lot of stuff was different. It was almost like the mode was made by people who didn't play the game back then. So while I had fun with it because the old maps were back, I still think that was just a wasted experiment too. Now, even though the arcade events are like a total waste, I do think they have the greatest potential to make a difference here, because what they could do is just constantly experiment with them, you know, just small value tweaks and off the wall ideas just to shake things up, you know. Even some of like the changes that they would normally do in the test server, they could just do in the arcade mode. And even though I didn't love the idea, arguably Attrition was kind of the best experiment because it took a familiar concept and just kind of put a twist on it. I'll use the example from Valorant of Replication, which just launched. It's a game mode where you and your team all play the same agent. You vote on it and then it randomizes, which I think like hits the nail on the head so well of this concept because it's simple. I'm sure it was not hard to make that. And it encourages experimentation with your utility, and there's like emergent gameplay that you wouldn't see in a regular game where everyone's on a different agent. Like I've seen people walling themselves into a room with sage walls, and even like as a marketing tool, just the content creation potential is so high with that. And the replayability is great too, because you want to try it with like every single agent. And the best part is that it isn't just going to go away after 2 weeks. It's going to last for the whole act, I believe. I think Siege could do that idea exactly. Like they could literally just copy that and it would be super fun. But in general, I would just like to see different ideas and kind of a constant rotation in this arcade mode, and just have them always exploring and monitoring new ideas and tweaks to the game. Even like something like the attacker repick and droning after death could have been tested using the arcade mode. They don't have to announce that it's going to be coming to the game. Just try it out and see what people think. To kind of sum up what I'm saying here, the big thing is that we need minimum 1 new map per year. It's been shown that maps take way more than 1 season to figure out anyways. Even the reworks sometimes do. I'd go as far as to say that it can take a whole year to figure out maps sometimes, but the sustained interest that would be generated by creating 1 new map a year would be like night and day from what we're witnessing now. I want to see less content that goes away. Rather than like muddying the map pool with more bomb maps, they don't need to make a new map every season. What they could do instead is introduce events that don't just go away after 2 weeks, that could throw in things like new deathmatch maps. Again, they don't have a deathmatch mode right now, but assuming that they ran with the idea they had in Sugar Fright and then figured out how to make that into a core game mode that people could use to warm up their aim or whatever, you could always throw in new stuff like that. Or like the Showdown map, the Fort Truth, the 3v3 map. Maybe you make that a permanent thing and you introduce new maps there. These could generate a smaller amount of interest without diluting or messing around with the balance of the game's premier game modes. I think they can stick to one operator per season, which is just status quo with how it is right now, and just sprinkle in the reworks where they make sense. I think you're in a pretty good spot with the operator pool, though. I don't think what we need is more operators every season. What I do think they could do, though, is experiment with those more major balancing changes in things like arcade mode, or even just in the test server. But I think that the arcade mode would be a cool way to test that out. And I think in general, just with the arcade mode, they should make it damn near permanent. It can have a rotation of new game modes at any given time. Maybe sprinkle old stuff in there and just like Golden Gun and Legacy, stuff like that. But in general, just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And just stop removing so much content from the game. I think it's fair that they want to keep the game's premier game modes focused and balanced with good maps and balanced operators. I kind of just wish they would find a solution where they can keep some legacy content available, like for fun, maybe as a separate download, like I said. And the events, they've started bringing the events back, but it would be cool if they could just be maybe downloaded and played whenever you want to. So this was clearly recorded before North Star was officially revealed, and while the reveal doesn't really change my opinion on anything here, I figured I may as well add on to this a little bit to address how the forthcoming content applies to what I said previously. Basically, to put it simply, I think that even if Ubisoft has heard some of the criticism regarding the Year 6 roadmap and the content or lack thereof, you almost definitely wouldn't start to see it yet. You have to think that they're considering and working on future content up to a year and maybe even more before it actually gets announced and released. So something like a new map wouldn't be conceived and created overnight, or really even in the span of a few months. That said, I still think Ubisoft are making some critical mistakes and heading further down a direction with how they're delivering content for this game that I'm not necessarily a fan of. I think the most glaring flaw with this season is the map. Now, I haven't played the new favela, so I won't comment on the quality of it. It could end up being a great rework, honestly. But again, just based on the look of it, even though the original favela is not a good map in its own right, they've essentially thrown out a unique take on a siege map in favor of something generic. Which of course means the old favela is just gone. And as per usual, I'm not a big fan of this. To my understanding, the new favela is by all accounts effectively a completely new map, sharing very little in common with its predecessor. So to call it a rework is entirely dishonest and serves nothing more than an excuse to dump old content from the game, which, as I've thoroughly expressed at this point, I am not a fan of. Additionally, the entire concept of a casual rework is inherently flawed, and I'm shocked that Ubisoft hasn't realized or even acknowledged that. On one hand, I don't mind the idea of keeping the casual maps of the game fresh, but the idea of reworking a map just for casual play alone is really dumb in my opinion. It's clear that casual reworks, when they're created, are treated with a similar brush to competitive reworks, like Border, for example. So Ubisoft's refusal to try them out in ranked or unranked is frankly absurd. On top of that, the lack of these maps being played in an even semi-competitive environment makes it so they will never really develop strategically, as high-level players will basically never play them. How do you even evaluate the success of these reworks then? I have no clue. I mean, I don't mind playing on the house rework. It feels like a pretty fun and balanced map, all things considered, but I also literally couldn't even tell you which site is best or really like a single attacking or defending strategy for this map either, because I've literally only played it in casual with people mostly running around like monkeys. Now, I've said already that I don't have a problem with one new operator per season. I still don't. Honestly, I think they could release no operators and the season could still be good, so long as the content void was filled with other things. Thunderbird, to me, is a bit underwhelming compared to the last few operators, but it doesn't really change my mind about the operator situation. I still feel as though one per season is the right move. I think Ubisoft, in general, needs to move away from new operators being the big thing every season and highlight different content for a change. Like, imagine how hype an entirely new permanent game mode could be, even if there isn't a new operator at all. I mean, Valorant did this recently with their new map Breeze and the new game mode Replication. Even without a new agent in a while, the game still has fresh and fun new content. I think Siege could really thrive on a model like this. So in terms of this content void that is left by Ubi not releasing multiple new operators and a new map every season, how are they filling this? I mean, based on this reveal, I think you can start to see the seeds of this. Essentially, it's balance changes, fundamental gameplay changes, and what I will respectfully call shit that nobody asked for. On one hand, I like to see fixes for things like bullet holes and client-side bodies, but on the other hand, Ubisoft treating these like they are new content is sort of ridiculous. These are the sort of fundamental quality of life changes that we should be expecting 5 to 6 years into a game's life, not necessarily celebrating. Balancing changes are also a bit of a weird spot because they're not really fun. They're usually subtractive in nature and aren't really exciting to test out and play around with. They really just improve the overall quality of the game and diminish frustration. So stuff like the Mira, Maestro, Melusi changes coming this season are a welcome addition, but not necessarily super exciting. And then you have, like I said, the shit that nobody really asked for. Things like the muzzle attachment changes, and I hate to say it, but the droning and utility usage after death change that is coming to the test server. Now, I've defended this particular idea before, but at the end of the day, it seems like a lot of development time and effort has gone into making this a reality, and I'm kind of left wondering, why? Did the game really need this? I don't think this is going to make or break the enjoyment of people who already play and enjoy the game, so the only conclusion I can really come to is that this is a change focused on making the game more approachable for newer players. But I'm just really struggling to see it having that effect. I just don't see new and casual players driving their drone around when they're dead. While I don't think it will make or break anyone's experience of the game really, I'm just struggling to see the motive behind it that has necessitated diverting development time away from other areas and into this particular feature. Now, I don't really need to touch on it in depth again, but events also seem to be cannibalizing a large amount of development time. But I think there's still a missed opportunity most of the time. We have yet to see what Season 2 will bring us in terms of events, but I expect it will be more of the same as what we saw in Crimson Heist, namely one old event brought back, an arcade event, and a premiere special event. So yeah, I haven't really seen anything from this season that tells me Ubisoft is straying from their philosophy of content delivery that I've been quite critical of throughout this video. Again, giving them the benefit of the doubt, I'm sure it isn't so simple to overhaul your content for the year when it's probably all already in development, but I'm looking for signs that they're at least aware of the mounting frustration with their design philosophy here, and I'm just not seeing it yet. But we'll see how this holds up in the future. So this is where I'd normally just cut to my outro card, but given that a lot of new people watched the last video, I figured I'd take a second to actually do a proper outro. I don't really normally do this discussion type stuff, but if you enjoy this, please let me know and feel free to check out the other content of this type that I've done before. Additionally, I stream on Twitch and I make all sorts of other videos on games beyond just Siege even, though my channel has been primarily Siege focused until recently. On the stream where I did this talk right after I made a tier list of my favorite events from Siege, which is on the screen right now if you want to watch, feel free to click onto that. Anyways, no matter how you found this, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.
Hit that like
This is
button.
alright.
Smash that bell, hit that bell button, hit this
Destroy my
bell
pussy.
button.
Subscribe to Dumper Man.